Why is it that so many of the villains in superhero movies are just color palette swapped versions of the heroes? While in part it's because less than talented people need some way to show which of the pair of characters is which, there's also another possible reason. Often in these stories, the big bad personifies the theme of the story by showing the road not taken by the hero. Give the audience a representation of the theme through the big bad's actions. For instance, in the novel that I've written, and I'm trying to get published, there's a theme of choosing to be the person you were born to be, instead of the person that culture tries to force you to be. And while the main antagonist of the story is the brainwashed weapon that the protagonist was forced to become, it is a story of redemption after all. Another of the primary villains is someone who charms others to perform her will, regardless of whether or not it's in the other person's best interest. Thus, the bad guys are the harmful choices forced onto the main character, and the person who forced those bad choices onto him. And through them you can see the importance of choice, and the negative ramifications of harmful ones forced upon a person. The bad guys are the personification of the theme. And this can even be true in stories that record real events, like we see in our passage for this sermon, 1 Samuel chapter 4. In this series, which I've called A Song of Failures and Hope, we've seen that the book of Samuel has a theme of, despite the problems of this life and the human evil that brings them about, God's king will reign and bring restoration to his humble people. Short version, God is at work despite the evils that bring about failure. And though we might assume that the bad guys of the story thus far are Eli's ungodly sons, Hophni and Phinehas, they're hardly a cameo in comparison to the big bads of the entire book of Samuel. There's an enemy that spans not only the story arcs of Eli and Samuel, but also Saul and David as well. An enemy who arrives on the scene in our chapter for this sermon. An enemy who takes center stage as they contend with God, the true protagonist of the book of Samuel, for the next few chapters, and then will repeatedly pop up afterward. And these enemies are the Philistines. A little bit of background on this antagonistic people might be required before we get into how they personify the theme of the book. History shows us that a group known as the Sea People arrived on the western coast of the Promised Land during the time of the conquest of Canaan, during the time of Joshua and Judges. They came from various Aegean cultures, the islands in the Mediterranean between Greece and Turkey. Yeah, that's where the Palestinians have their real ancestral origins. And because of the Sea People's skill at ironworking, when most were still using bronze as their primary weapon metal, they quickly conquered the areas along the coast of Canaan. Among those listed are the Hittites and the other ites, whom the Israelites were supposed to wipe out by the command of God. Remember, the Israelites had been told to act as God's agents of justice and wipe out the sinful peoples of Canaan, all of those ite people. And though the people of Israel got off to a good start during the time of Joshua and shortly into the beginning of the Judges period, they ultimately failed to wipe all those people out that they were commanded to. The failure of God's people to do as he commands, even when he remains faithful to them, seems to be a refrain throughout salvation history. And ultimately, it was through the Philistines, people who would never worship the God of Israel, that God rendered his justice against many of those sinful ites in the land of Canaan. Despite the sin and failure of God's people to perform his justice, God worked his will in this world, despite it. And he did it in part through the people who would become known as the Philistines. Even before we get to their introduction in the book of Samuel, they personify its theme. Despite the failures of people and the evil in this world, God will continue to do his work. A couple last bits of background about the Philistines before we actually get into 1 Samuel 4. It was ultimately the Egyptians that halted the Philistines' spread along the coast of the Mediterranean. And by the time of Samuel, the Philistines had solidified as a people group within 5 cities on the coast of the sea in southern Israel. So with all of that background, we can get into the Philistines' introduction, which rightly shows them at war with the Israelites. But even more importantly to the overall story, we see what happens when word of God's presence resounds in the ears of both sides of this battle. 1 Samuel chapter 4, verses 1 to 11. And the word of Samuel came to all Israel. Now Israel went out to battle against the Philistines. They encamped at Ebenezer. And the Philistines encamped at Aphek. The Philistines drew up in line against Israel, and when the battle spread, Israel was defeated by the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 men on the field of battle. And when the troops came to the camp, the elders of Israel said, "Why has the Lord defeated us today before the Philistines? Let us bring the ark of the covenant of the Lord here from Shiloh, that it may come among us and save us from the power of our enemies." So the people went to Shiloh and brought from there the ark of the covenant of the Lord of hosts, who is enthroned on the cherubim. And the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant of God. As soon as the ark of the covenant of the Lord came into the camp, all of Israel gave a mighty shout, so that the earth resounded. And when the Philistines heard the noise of the shouting, they said, "What does this great shouting in the camp of the Hebrews mean?" And when they learned that the ark of the Lord had come to the camp, the Philistines were afraid. For they said, "A god has come into the camp." And they said, "Woe to us, for nothing like this has happened before. Woe to us, who can deliver us from the power of these mighty gods? These are the gods who struck the Egyptians with every sort of plague in the wilderness. Take courage and be men, O Philistines, lest you become slaves to the Hebrews, as they have been to you. Be men and fight." So the Philistines fought, and Israel was defeated. And they fled every man to his house. And there was a very great slaughter, for there fell of Israel 30,000 foot soldiers. And the ark of God was captured, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, died. A whole lot of stuff happens in those 11 verses, but let's hit the important parts. First, we are reminded that this happened during the time that Samuel grew as a prophet in Israel. He'd already given the prophecy that Hophni and Phinehas would die on the same day as judgment against the household of Eli, because of their blasphemy. And because Samuel remained in line with God's commands, he seemed to be the rising hope for the people. But since this chapter deals with the end of Eli's story arc, Samuel fades into the background for the rest of it. And he'll continue to be unmentioned in the next couple of chapters because God is the true protagonist of the story. But I get a little ahead of myself. The second part of verse 1 shows Israel at war with the Philistines. Their battle line the halfway mark between Shiloh and the northernmost of the Philistine cities. 20-ish miles between the two cities. And the battle didn't go well for Israel. Their casualties added up to no small number of warriors. After this initial defeat, the leaders of the people asked why they had lost. Notice the only good part of their reasoning. They asked why it was that God had struck them down that day. It was not the Philistines who beat them, or their false gods, as I'm sure the Philistines would believe, but rather God, the God of Israel, who had allowed this defeat to happen. Their question was an excellent one, but their answer wasn't. The Israelite leaders figured that it had to be because they didn't have the Ark of the Covenant with them, as if God was limited to the range of a physical object in order to bring about his will in the world. After all, during the early battles in the conquest of Canaan, the Ark had been amidst the battle line. But what they had failed to recognize was not only the amazing power of God to enact his will through the entirety of his creation, regardless of the location of a gold-covered wooden box that represented his heavenly throne, but also the fact that God works in his own will, not the will of his followers. Sometimes we get so caught up in our perceived right actions and plans that we move without God, or just assume that he's going to come along with us for the ride, as if God will just go along with our plans because he owes it to us for our worship to him. God's not a vending machine of blessing. He's not obligated to give us what we want just because we've put in the right amount of payment. God's work in history will happen, even despite our perceived holiness, which is often just self-directed glory with a godly veneer. We need to remember that we work with God. He doesn't do what we want him to. So let's not act like the elders of Israel, because what they believed to be the surefire ticket to victory over the Philistines turned out to be the victory of God's promised will through the defeat of the Israelites. See, if the Israelites needed the Ark of the Covenant to be among them, then there needed to be very specific people to bear the Ark. Only certain priests could be responsible for bearing it. And it just so happened that a pair of such priests lived in the same spot where the Ark rested. A pair of priests who had a pesky prophecy concerning their death sentence, which was to be carried out on the same day. That pair, Hophni and Phinehas, the sons of Eli. And so, the pair hefted the Ark, propped between them on the gold-covered poles. When they arrived, they had to feel like celebrities. The army rejoiced at their presence. Well, really, it was at the presence of the Ark. But the box was only there because the pair of brothers, who were more interested in what the position could afford them than the actual worship of God that they were there to represent. The army cheered because they saw victory. Sure, some might truly have rejoiced in true worship, but many among the Israelites only saw the victory that God's presence was supposed to bring them. There was rejoicing at the presence of God, but it was more about what it could do for them than actual worship. On the other side of the battlefield, we see the Philistines' response in verses 6 to 10. They heard the Israelites shout, resounding through the valley between them. It was like a victory cry. But how could that be, when last that the Philistines had checked, the Israelites had suffered a terrible defeat? But the report of the scouts left the Philistines shaken. There was a new player on the field. Or so they would believe, considering the fact that they thought, as the Israelites wrongfully thought, that the power of their God was bound to the presence of a physical object used in his worship. But the Philistines knew that this was not just any god. No, this was the God who had stricken the Egyptians with plague upon plague. Remember, the Egyptians were the people who had stopped the spread of the Philistines. And now the God who had beat the Egyptians had his eye on this battle. How would they ever be able to overcome such a powerhouse? The one who defeated them. True reverence of the God of Israel shook them to the core. A reverence more pure than what the Israelites, who were supposedly the ones to worship God, held for him in that same moment. The Israelites heard the name of God and saw victory, the Israelite people's victory. But the Philistines heard the name of God and saw the victorious God. Though they would never properly worship him, it was the Philistines who had the most worshipful response. Yet despite this response, a few among the Philistines, probably aided by the work of God, who would bring about his own victory through the defeat of his own people, rose up to rally the troops. Woe to us, you say! This is the most terrible thing that's ever happened to us? Man up, Philistines! You act as though we're already servants of the Israelites. We are free men, and we will fight as free men, because it is better to die as free warriors than live as groveling servants. No matter the outcome, we will fight. And fight they did, routing the Israelites even worse in the second round than in the first. But not only that, they captured the Ark of the Covenant, killing the pair of priests who carried it. The Philistines considered it a great victory for them. They defeated the God who had stricken the Egyptians. They overcame the odds all by themselves, or so it would seem to them. But we who followed the story so far should know better. It might have seemed like victory for the enemies of God and the defeat of his chosen nation. But this supposed defeat was actually a victory in the work of God for his people. It was a fulfillment of his promised work, because the blasphemous found God's justice in their death sentence. 2 prophecies over the past couple of chapters of 1 Samuel have shown us that these deaths were the precursor of far greater work. They were the proof that greater work was to come. And the God of Israel had actually performed them, exactly as he promised. The pair died on the same day, and so it proves that he is able to bring about all the other great works that he has promised to his people. But oftentimes in our defeat, we forget this. We forget God's greatness and his work that will happen. And our failure to see a victory of God amidst seeming defeat leads us to more negative consequences. 1 Samuel chapter 4, verses 12 to 22. A man of Benjamin ran from the battle line and came to Shiloh the same day, with his clothes torn and dirt on his head. When he arrived, Eli was sitting on his seat by the road watching, for his heart trembled for the ark of God. And when the man came into the city and told the news, all the city cried out. When Eli heard the sound of this outcry, he said, "What is this uproar?" Then the man hurried and came and told Eli. Now Eli was 98 years old, and his eyes were set so that he could not see. And the man said to Eli, "I am he who has come from the battle. I fled from the battle today." And he said, "How did it go, my son?" He who brought the news answered and said, "Israel has fled before the Philistines, and there also has been a great defeat among the people. Your 2 sons also, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark of God has been captured." As soon as he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell over backward from his seat by the side of the gate, and his neck was broken and he died, for the man was old and heavy. He had judged Israel 40 years. Now his daughter-in-law, the wife of Phinehas, was pregnant, about to give birth. And when she heard the news that the ark of God was captured, and that her father-in-law and her husband were dead, she bowed and gave birth, for her pains came upon her. And about the time of her death, the women attending her said to her, "Do not be afraid, for you have borne a son." But she did not answer or pay attention. And she named the child Ichabod, saying, "The glory has departed from Israel," because the ark of God had been captured, and because of her father-in-law and her husband. And she said, "The glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured." So one of the few escaping soldiers made it for Shiloh. Anyone who saw him could tell that it was bad news that he was reporting, because he had torn his clothes and covered his head with the dirt of mourning. But there was one man who awaited news for the battle, a man who couldn't see. We find Eli once again sitting in that same seat that he was when he was introduced in the story at the beginning of the book. Only this time he waited and watched for news. Being the lookout is a strange place to be for a blind man. But this is where Eli set himself. He knew the prophecies against his sons. He knew that battle would be an easy way to have both of them killed on the same day. But notice that verse 13 shows his concern was not over his sons, as it had been for so long. No, his concern was over the Ark of the Covenant. He trembled that it might be lost in the process of losing his sons. Little did he know that it had, but he would soon find out. Through the city, news of the loss began to spread, and the uproar of defeat resounded almost as loudly as the army had shouted when the ark had joined the ranks. Eli's response concerning the shouts even mirrors the Philistines' response in verse 6. What is this voice of uproar? Why all the shouting? The man who had escaped the battle came before Eli's seat, no doubt on his knees in defeat. "I have news of battle," he said. Interesting thing about the word for news used in verse 17 is that it has the connotation of good news, or at least neutral news. It never carries the idea of bad news, unless you count this one instance. But since we have the context of this seeming defeat actually being victory for God's plan, we can understand the use of this word for good news. This is good news. Good news of defeat, because God is not defeated. At Eli's request for the events, the man said that the Israelites were routed in battle. Eli's sons had fallen in battle, and the ark had been taken. At the mention of the ark being lost, not the death of his sons, Eli fell over off his seat, and because of age and his body's girth, he died in the fall. Verse 18 gives his life the same epitaph that the leaders of Israel had in the book of Judges. He judged Israel 40 years. At the end of Eli's story arc in the book of Samuel, we see a man who once had been a hope for God's people, a deliverer whom God had raised for a special purpose, like so many of the judges before him. But because of sin, because of turning a blind eye to the blasphemous sins of others, he failed to live up to that hope. And so the story had to continue to another. Despite Eli's failure, God's work continues on. But again, many miss the victory amidst the seeming defeat. And that includes the wife of Phinehas, whose reaction to all of this news we see in verses 19 to 22. Phinehas' wife had been close to the end of her time of pregnancy. She could have given birth any second. But once news reached her, she went straight into labor, distress making her pull a Padme. She died of a broken heart shortly after naming the child. The name Ichabod means there is no glory. It's like naming your child loser. Her perspective was like many who see the seeming defeat of God's people without taking into account the work of God continuing exactly as he promised, despite the evil of those who seem to live in victory. Phinehas' wife equated the loss of the ark with God's glory being taken from Israel. But she failed to recognize that God's power didn't reside in a gold-covered box. He wasn't limited to its location. And the taking of the ark didn't mean that God's promises had fallen through. His glory shines through his work. It's not dependent upon the possession of a physical object. He is the God who works despite seeming defeat, the one who brings restoration to his humble people despite the evil of this world, despite the problems of our life that seem to overpower his work. That restoration sometimes has to come about by teaching us to properly worship him, to relieve us of the faulty understandings of our worship of him, to cut out the sinful parts that rebel in blasphemy against him. Sometimes we must face defeat so that we might seek God rightly and join him in his work, not tacking God on at the end of our plans, not using him as some magical talisman to get our way, or a vending machine that pays out based off of our payment. These seeming defeats call us to restoration in our relationship with him. Sometimes God allows seeming defeat in the lives of his people in order to bring about greater victory than we could ever imagine. But we're too often focused only on our own immediate loss that we miss out on the greater work of God. The Israelites did that during the events recorded in 1 Samuel 4. And the followers of Jesus did the same thing those few days that he was in the grave. The cross, Jesus' death, seemed like such a defeat that none could ever imagine how God could still be in control. But that is exactly what he is. In control. The cross, the death of the body crafted for the second person of the Trinity, had always been the plan. That defeat was always the plan. And through it, God brought about the greatest hope that would never fall to failure. Jesus is the priest, prophet, and king through whom God brings restoration to his humble people. We who humble ourselves before the cross. God keeps his word about his work, even when defeat seems to overpower it, because the work of God will always be supreme. The question is, what areas of our lives seem to leave us in defeat? Where are we fearful that God's promises have failed? What makes us think that God's glory has left us? What leaves us calling it Ichabod? For some of us, the answer to those questions will lead us to a place where our understanding of godliness and holiness are faulty, where we're expecting victory merely because we have a gold-covered box, a false God whom we can manipulate to do our will, but who will ultimately fail us, because a God of our own making is only as sure as ourselves, and we humans are prone to failure. Our defeat comes because we made a God who agrees with us, instead of following the powerful creator of the universe, adhering to his commands. For others, the seeming defeats come because we are only focused on our individual losses, instead of the greater victories that God has in store. Not that we're necessarily guaranteed greater things in this life, but the wider work of God that brings restoration to his humble people, the hope that resides in our King and Savior, our sure path to walk, despite the evils of this world brought about because of sin. God's King reigns, and his work will flow exactly as he planned and promised. It might seem like defeat right now, and only small victories are all that we have, but God has a greater victory planned, and he remains undefeated.